Okay, so this meeting is being recorded. It will be made available later on the Orca Senior Center website, and it may also be posted to social media for promotional and/or educational purposes. So welcome to everyone. I'm John Slater with Orca Senior Center. This is our 8th scheduled presentation for the 2021 season of Meeting of the Minds on Zoom. Today's presentation is Rediscovered Fruit: Conserving the Island's Ancient Food Forests, with speaker Madrona Murphy. So before we get started, hi Madrona, I'm just going to explain some features with on Zoom if you're not familiar. Right now you are all on mute, so you will find the microphone icon in the lower left of your screen that says unmute below it. You'll notice that if you click on it, you'll see it says the host is not allowing participants to unmute themselves. This is just to prevent interference during the presentation. After the presentation, I will change the setting to allow you to use the microphone to unmute yourselves to ask questions. So next to the microphone icon, you'll see the video start stop icon. Clicking this allows you to either be seen or not seen. You may choose whatever is comfortable for you. And you can toggle back and forth with that same icon. And lastly, at the top right of your screen, you'll see the view icon. This icon allows you to change how people are displayed on your screen. So you may choose between gallery and speaker view, and the speaker view features the speaker predominantly and minimizes everybody else. So that's what I would recommend for this presentation today. Now let's get on to our main feature. Our presenter today is Madrona Murphy. She's a Reed graduate in botany and political science who worked as a technician at the University of Washington's Center for Cell Dynamics at Friday Harbor Laboratories before establishing and managing Kwiat's genotyping laboratory. As Kwiat's botanist, she also conducts botanical surveys, designs revegetation plans for restoration projects, and in Kwiat's research garden, she grows native food plants and heritage apple varieties. Madrona was born and raised on Lopez Island and is currently studying native food plants, local populations of salmon, heritage fruit trees, black-tailed deer, and island bats. So that's quite comprehensive. Regarding today's presentation, Madrona notes that large orchards were everywhere in the San Juan Islands in 1897 when the US Coast Guard and the geodetic survey maps were completed. Islands were growing and exporting fruit throughout the Northwest and the country, an astonishing scale for such a small geographical area. While the industry has waned, trees and their varieties have adapted to our island climate, and their unique seedling offspring are still a critical component of the island's foodscape and surprisingly dynamic agro ecosystem, supporting diverse species of bats and birds. And with that, I turn it over to Madrona. Welcome, Madrona.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to pull my presentation up here. Let me just screen share so you can see what I'm doing here. And then bring this up to full screen. All right. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the island's food forest, the ancient food forests in the San Juan Islands, and a little bit, I'm going to give you a little map of what sort of a roadmap to where this presentation is going. So why do we have these ancient food forests? What do I mean by the food forests as agroecosystems? What kind of fruit do they produce? That'll be a little intro to some of the heritage varieties. What can you do with the heritage fruit? And what are some enterprising islanders doing with heritage fruit, producing with it? How do you look after these food forests and these old trees? And how can you participate in the projects we're doing to rediscover these islands' ancient food forests and some of the varieties that are uniquely adapted to our climate and our ecosystem here? So let's get started. Why do the islands have ancient food forests? This is from those T-sheets, those maps that were made by the US Coast and Geodetic Survey. This one I think is from 1894. And this is around what's now Camp Orkyla. And you can see that all those dots there represent orchard. They're not representing the individual trees, but they're showing you the extent of the orchard. And that's the Seattle Fruit Company's orchard at the time. So why do the islands have ancient food forests? Because people planted orchards everywhere. This is the same area, slightly zoomed out from aerial photos that were taken by the Canadian military in 1932. And you can see the orchards at the time it actually expanded. So every row there is trees. Down by the shore, there's some pears along with the apples. Up above, it's probably many, many apples and some pears and possibly prunes. There was a prune craze as part of the orchard expansion on Orcas. And Orcas is the center, really, of these ancient food forests in the islands. I have an industrial map of Washington State that points out the different industries in different parts of the state. And for Orcas, it just is fruit on particularly on the west lobe of Orcas. So here these islands were the center of an industry that started as far back as the 1840s and continued on. Now, that industry peaked around 1900 and started to decline, starting even as early as 1910. This is the census of fruit trees in San Juan County from work that Boyd Pratt and Sandy Strelu did for their historic barns project. And you can see there were 100,000 plus fruit trees in San Juan County around 1900, declining down to 59 when this stops. And I think that we've actually seen some increase since that time. But there are food forests because people planted huge numbers of trees, but it's a little more interesting and complicated than that. They planted those trees here because the islands are excellent habitat for fruit trees. This is our native apple, Malus fusca, or Pacific crab apple. This is a grove on Lopez. And you can see these trees are quite extensive, they're filling up the area. We have a habitat that works beautifully for apples, and in which apples, at least, and in my experience also pears and plums and quince and cherries, will produce without extensive irrigation. And that's a critical point in terms of looking at the timing of orchard building in the islands, and the decline. Because that decline is to some extent associated with the availability of irrigation water in Eastern Washington, where apples can be produced on a very large scale, but only when water is available. Now, I'm going to argue as we go on that having that ability to dry farm fruit trees, apples, pears, plums, cherries, quince in the islands gives us a superlative, unique product. We produce apples that are more dense in flavor and are ecologically more sustainable because they don't have to be irrigated. But so here, these natural ancient food forests are the reason why the islands were so well suited to starting an industry based on orchards. But it's even more interesting than that. So this is the tea sheet from Cayuga Lagoon in Deer Harbor from either 1894, 1895. And you can sort of see in this up on the top and on either side of the lagoon, there are orchards there. And I'm going to zoom in on those orchards so you can see the names on them. So the upper orchard around the top of the lagoon was Louis Caillou or Louis Caillou. And down further around kind of where the resort is, across the road from there, was Henry Caillou. So these names are important because these weren't just random people in the islands deciding to grow fruit trees. Louis Caillou and Mary Caillou were some of the first homesteaders around Deer Harbor. And Mary Caillou was a member of the Mitchell Bay tribe that had their home on San Juan. So this is a native family continuing a tradition of anthropogenic landscapes, so human-built landscapes that are food producing in the islands. So building on the tradition of things like camas cultivation and managing native apple groves, going ahead and taking advantage of the availability of European apple and pear varieties and planting an orchard. One of the oldest orchards on Orcas was planted by Louis Caillou and Mary Caillou. And then their son Henry, who also identified as a member of the Mitchell Bay tribe, planted an extensive orchard nearby. On Lopez and San Juan, some of the oldest orchards were also planted by Coast Salish families. And I think that's an important part of the history of fruit growing in the islands, that it's part of a continuous tradition of using these islands in a productive way that produces enough food that can be exported from the islands, but at the same time is ecologically sustainable. So that's true of the way in which camas was cultivated in the islands, and that's true of the way in which fruit has been cultivated in the islands. So this is a legacy that may start in the 1840s, but it builds upon a tradition that's at least 200, if not many thousand years older. So what do I mean when I talk about these ancient food forests as agroecosystems? So an agroecosystem is the totality of that ecosystem that includes agriculture, or in this case, something a little more like horticulture. So what is it that lives and makes up these food forests, and why am I calling them food forests rather than just orchards? So why am I calling them food forests rather than just orchards? Well, that's because as these orchards have stayed in the islands, have been established. So when we started looking at ancient orchards, we found that they also produced a lot of our native fruiting shrubs like thimbleberry and the wild blackberries. Serviceberry grows in with a lot of these. Wild crabapple has filled in. And at the same time, they support a diversity of animals within them as well. So here you can see there's a pileated woodpecker eating an apple in one of the oldest orchards on San Juan Island. These old fruit trees form amazing nesting cavities. So we talk a lot about the importance of deciduous trees for nesting cavities, but we don't tend to look at European apples as potential nest cavity sources, and they form very high quality nest cavities, as you can see. This is a photo from one of the old orchards on Lopez. And then these trees have dead wood if they haven't been maintained, and that dead wood can actually provide important habitat for native bees that they'll either make their own holes, or sometimes they'll use holes built by beetles to nest in, and then they forage on the blossoms and provide pollination services at the same time. And the pests that are in these orchards can be very important food for birds and bats. So it's a whole system. There's a lot of the caterpillars, the lepidopterans, that feed on apples in particular, are also ones that can be very important forage for bats and are available around the time that mother bats are looking for high quality food because they're nursing pups. And so I'm going to talk about how maintaining a food forest sometimes means not eradicating all of your pests so that you can maintain a healthy predator population. So bats are natural pest control in orchards, but some of them may also make use of those cavities in the trees for nesting. We have two species of tree roosting bats in the islands, the silver-haired bats. Some of you may have encountered them because they will, in the winter sometimes, they'll find people's wood piles a good place to rest. But they roost in tree cavities. When they're just out by themselves, they'll just hang in trees. But then when they're pupping, they don't form large maternity colonies. They form little tiny colonies in tree cavities. And then the hoary bats, which are also foliage nesting bats, so they hang in trees. They're also tree roosters, and they may make use of these cavities or of other habitat within these orchards. So bats in the islands are our most abundant and diverse mammals. We have 9 different species, but bats, even those species of bats that are abundant in the islands, are often rare elsewhere. So this is an important aspect of having these food forests, is that they provide a rich food source for bats, which are abundant in the islands, and we serve as kind of a refuge for bats within the Pacific Northwest. Undisturbed orchards also have a diverse soil communities. They act as carbon sinks. These trees are very old and they've got extensive root systems. And the CO2 that they've fixed to build those roots is going to stay in those roots as long as those trees are alive. They've got a really long lifetime. People often tell me that their old orchards are nearing the end of their lives. And I like to tell them that there are orchards in Europe that are still producing and still being harvested that are 400 years old. I think we very much underestimate the life of some of these trees. They do need human care sometimes to survive for that long, but they have a very long lifetime. And when you compare that to what's estimated to be the natural lifetime, that's the full turnover of a forest in the Pacific Northwest, the Forest Service estimates that at about 500 years. our ancient food forests definitely can survive at least 200 years. So that's an order of magnitude longer than the way in which island forests are managed for timber, where the turnover can be on the order of 20 to 50 years. So you have a much more stable ecosystem in which a lot of that carbon is locked in the wood, in the soil, and the orchards continue to produce food throughout that lifetime. So this picture here is the root system of one of the old trees that got upended during a windstorm. And you can see it's very well anchored. Those roots spread as wide as the crown of that tree. I think this tree was put back upright and continued to grow as well. Some of the things that make use of orchards here, that's a native minor bee, an andrena. It's actually on a cherry blossom. The tree trunk there, you can see, has sapsucker holes. So sapsuckers will come and drill holes. This is pretty universal on the trunks of old pears and apples. And clearly it doesn't harm the tree too much, because these trees that we're looking at are 100, 120 years old, and they're just covered in these sapsucker holes. Then there's a syrphid larva. Syrphid are flower flies, and they're really important pollinators in orchards because they can fly much earlier than most bees can. But they're even more interesting because their larvae are predatory. And so that's a syrphid larva eating an aphid. And they provide important pest control inside of an orchard at the same time as the adults will provide you with pollination services. And then even after the trees die, they can provide important habitat, not just for bees and beetles, but also for fungi. So the picture in the bottom there, that's turkey tail fungus growing where a tree had either fallen or been cut down, and making use of that wood to digest it. And then that'll help feed the soil and continue that process of locking carbon into the soil. So given the habitat value, it's important that if you are the caretaker or owner of one of these ancient food forests, that you be a good host to all of these creatures that make use of it with you. So you want to be careful not to contaminate that habitat with pesticides. If you are trying to kill insects and instead you end up with a lot of insects that have been non-lethally dosed, that then moves into the birds and the bats that forage in your orchard. You want to leave some dead wood as habitat. It doesn't have to be in the way. It doesn't even have to be on the tree, but it is important habitat. Making water available will increase the habitat value. So having a water source that bats or birds can drink from, and bees, being careful that it's got a way out so that none of those critters will drown in your water source. And maintaining this balance so that you have food for your predators. So like if you want syrphid flies, you're gonna have to put up with some aphids, but they'll help you manage that population of aphids. One of the things that might seem counterintuitive is we encourage people not to ever introduce bees as pollinators. We have an abundant community of native bees and flies that already pollinate our orchards, and introduced bees compete with them. And in some cases can bring diseases that they can pass along to those wild bees. Keeping honeybees is a different issue if you're keeping them for honey. The important thing is to make sure your habitat is diverse enough that you can support both those honeybees and the wild bees. But don't get honeybees because you want pollination. There's a sufficient number of wild pollinators here. So be a good host to your wild bees by giving them sort of first pick. And if you are a honeybee keeper, a beekeeper, making sure that you provide sufficient habitat so that both your honeybees and the wild bees can make use of your orchard. And leaving some untended areas. That's what I'm trying to show you in some of these pictures, is kind of the wild area around the orchard. Those are really critical for bees to nest in. A lot of our native bees are ground nesters, and some of them also nest in the dead stalks of shrubs. And so just having a little bit of that will increase your pollinator diversity. And nesting habitat is really the limiting factor. Some of our native bees travel very, very short distances between their nests and where they're seeking pollen and nectar. So having that habitat right nearby is going to significantly increase the access. Now, if you're looking for syrphid flies to do pollination, some of them also lay their eggs in kind of moist areas where you've got wet soil, sometimes stagnant standing water. It doesn't sound like the most attractive habitat, but that's where some of their larvae will will incubate. And so having some wet spots, which apples and pears do very well with, can also increase, particularly your early spring pollinators. Pear flowers aren't terribly attractive to bees, and so having some flies around can significantly increase the likelihood that all of your flowers will be pollinated. What kind of fruits do these ancient forests produce? This is the rediscovered fruit part. The islands are full of old varieties that are now very abundant in our old orchards, but not so common commercially. And I'm going to give you a quick tour of some of the most common of those varieties. Keep in mind, this is just scratching the surface. King apples are the most common heritage apple we see in old orchards, and they're wonderful, they're versatile, they're multi-purpose. These are large striped apples that keep pretty well, very greasy, but they're good baked, they're good juiced, they're good fresh, and they keep all right. They are, however, triploid, which means they don't produce viable pollen. And so an orchard that's just Kings will produce no fruit. Another very common variety in old orchards, and one that I think is very much undervalued, is the Rhode Island greening, or more commonly in the islands just referred to as greening. It's a cooking apple. It's perfectly fine to eat fresh, just kind of tart. And it also can make very nice cider, although it oxidizes really quickly, so it makes a brown cider. But where it really shines is for cooking. It's very dense, it breaks down. So this is more of a butter and sauce apple than a pie apple. And it has just an amazing, rich flavor. I think that it's an apple that belongs in any orchard of anyone who bakes with their apples or who likes apple butter. Again, it's a triploid. So an orchard of just greenings and just Kings still isn't going to produce any fruit. Gravensteins are probably one of our better known local apples. These are large, early, lumpy. We even have our own local variety of Gravenstein that was discovered around Olga in 1905 and widely marketed, which is the Olga Red Gravenstein, and that's in the watercolor there. That's actually the particular variety. There are other red Gravensteins, but this is the one from Olga. Because of their high sugar and acid content, they're often used in cider making as well as for fresh eating and cooking. They're very early and they don't keep particularly well. And again, these are triploid. A lot of our large apples are. So you still haven't got a viable orchard if all you have is Kings and greenings and Gravenstein. You might want to add a 20-ounce Pippin in there because they're not triploid and they overlap with the Gravenstein Kings and greenings. These are large, rounder apples. They're not as oblong as the Kings, not great keepers, but very, very nice for sauce. Big, big striped apples, similar in size and color to King, but different shape and a tangier flavor. The blue pearmain is the prettiest apple I've ever grown. It really has a bloom on it that makes it almost purple. Very dense, tastes kind of like a King, but denser and keeps better. These are not as common in old orchards, but they ought to be. They bake well and apparently juice quite nicely as well. I haven't had enough to juice them. They have a wonderful flavor and they look like they've been painted. Roxbury russets are one of the more common of the russeted apples. That's not a disease that makes them brown, that's natural. Russets generally are very dry fleshed apples, very sweet, with a nutty flavor, tend to have high acidity, which makes them good for cider, even though they don't produce a huge amount of juice. And the Roxbury keeps quite well as well. There are definitely Roxburys in old orchards on Orcas. And I think they're, the russets in general, but Roxburys in particular, are just delicious apples. They're very good sliced with cheese. It's one of the oldest American apples as well. So we got them after they'd already been bouncing around on the East Coast for quite a while. Bellflower is another apple that is common in old orchards and not particularly well known. Very variable in shape. What I've got here are a couple pictures of bellflowers that are more classically bellflower shaped. So they're shaped like the flowers on like salal, that's the bellflower. And they have this odd elongated core, which you can kind of see in that cut photo. To me, they taste like a firmer Gravenstein, but are later and keep well. Makes them an excellent cider apple, very good baking apple, very high sugar. This is one I think that people should be on the lookout for. They're really wonderful apples, very beautiful as well. Wagoner is another sort of lumpy round apple, one that is pretty much absent from the market at this point. It's a good keeper, ripens quite late. and apparently improves in storage. So a lot of the apples that were planted in these ancient food forests were apples that were intended to be shipped. And so you didn't want them to be ready right off the tree. You wanted them to keep through that shipping process. And these days, sometimes that makes them harder for people to get into because people are used to apples that they can eat right off the tree. And a lot of these varieties will improve if you pick them and then store them more like pears. Ben Davis is definitely an important apple on Orchis. There's a lot of them in the Kaufelt Farm orchard, and they're a very good keeper. In fact, they're one that definitely improves in storage. They have this funny little tiny core that makes them somewhat easier to identify. And they're one of the parents of the Cortland apple. So if people are familiar with that, this is one of the apples that made that one. Very pretty, disappointing straight off the tree, but much better flavor in storage, and they keep really, really well. Quick, some pears. I haven't done as much exploring of the pears in orchards, so these are photos from the USDA's watercolor collection, or photos of their watercolors. Anjou was planted in the islands. This is a necklace pear that stays green even when ripe. People are probably familiar with it, but it will grow here. Clapp's favorite, which is our early pear. It can be harvested in late August. Looks like a Bartlett, but with a red cheek, so it's got a more classic pear shape. Bartlett was the most common planted heritage pear in the islands. These are still in a lot of the old orchards. They look like what you expect a pear to look like, and they've got those grit cells. And then a couple more that were planted in the islands, Onondaga and Clairgeau. I probably pronounced those pretty badly, but these are pears you could be on a lookout for in some of the old orchards. And they've both been grown here since at least 1899, so quite old trees. We also have heritage plum varieties. Greengages seem to be one of the more common, and we have 3 different varieties of greengage. These are excellent preserving plums. They're very high in pectin, they're very sweet. They tend to be clingstones. They're a little messy to take apart, but they make excellent jams and preserves, and they're even rich enough in pectin that they can make a sliceable preserve. Prunes, of course. There was a prune craze on Orchis where people thought that the most lucrative tree fruit crop they could be growing was prunes, and then switched to pears and other things. But it means that prunes were planted throughout the islands, and there's actually at least 4 varieties that were planted, although the silver prune that is sometimes referred to in old reports of orcharding is actually a golden drop, Coe's golden drop plum that's been dried. These are sweet, they dry well, they're freestone, and they're all over the place, and they're wonderful preserving things. I mean, it's where Prune Alley gets its name, and the prunes still grow along there. There's the Coe's golden drop, which is the silver prune, and Hungarian plum, also known as pond seedling, that definitely grows on Orchis. And I don't know as much about it, but these are all ones to keep an eye out for. And because these orchards, so that's just scratching the surface, because these orchards were planted, many of them, 100, 120 years ago, they've been producing seedlings all around them. And so not only are there many varieties that we didn't talk about here, but there's many varieties that are truly unique to the islands, including hybrids between our native crabapple and the apples that people were planting. So not only have we got this incredible wealth of heritage varieties, but we also have something that is completely unique of these varieties that have never existed anywhere else, that are unique crosses, just waiting to be discovered. So if you have an old orchard, you should sample your seedling trees as well, because you might discover a new variety that's uniquely adapted to the climate here and does really well. What can you do with these heritage fruit? Well, you can eat them, but it's often, so I work a lot on trying to identify fruit varieties for people. And I like to remind people that even if you can never figure out the name of your fruit, if you know how to use it, you've gained a lot of knowledge. So figuring out what your fruit works best for is more important than figuring out what the variety is called. We still try and figure out the variety because that leaps us into figuring out how people use them. And also is important if you want to be selling your fruit. It's nice to be able to give it a name and a history. But while you're still figuring that out, you can do all these things with apples, pears, plums, quince, cherries. How do you figure out what it's good for? Well, you taste it. The picture there is a baking test where I'm looking to see if apples will keep their shape when they're baked, which tells me whether they make good potential pie apples or whether they fall apart, in which case they might be potentially good saucing apples. Tasting also for things like tannins and tartness, how well fruit keeps. A lot of these are keeping fruit, and that sometimes you might be disappointed when you taste them fresh, but you set them aside, store them cool for a number of months, and you might have something really delicious. And then one of the things that we work on is actually evaluating the constituents of the chemical constituents of these fruit. You know, how high is the sugar, which tells us not just how sweet it tastes, but also the potential for fermentation or potential for fermentation and then distillation. What the acidity is, that helps balance that and also is important to make preserves. Tannins, those are important flavors in things like hard cider, and pectin. So if you want to make jam or jelly, having a good level of pectin is important. So these can tell you what the fruit's good for, even if it's a variety that has never been evaluated before. And there are some folks in the islands who do wonderful things with our heritage fruit. So over on San Juan, Madrone Cellars and Cider makes cider with heritage fruit, and they work with the orchard owners there, because in order to harvest the fruit from these heritage orchards, you need to look after them. So that's a partnership that they've developed. Girl Meets Dirt over on Orcas there also has these long-term partnerships with heritage orchards, as well as taking fruit from smaller orchards and providing product credit. So, and does a wonderful job of marketing fruit that's unique to Orcas. So, and telling the story of the products they make. They're a good place to go if you're looking to taste single varietal products made with local fruit. Boathouse Cider Works, also on Orcas, does amazing things with both the cultivated and the wild fruits that grow in old orchards. And I was very delighted with their senior cider from last year as a collaboration to support the community as well. Orcas Island Distillery is very creative in terms of taking the apples and pears and turning them, lifting them up a couple levels from from fermentation to distillation. Also including collaborating with farmers so that sometimes the pomace can go back as animal feed, and integrating that into the agro-ecosystem. So what else can you do with your fruit? Say you have a heritage orchard and you've got more fruit than you need, you can sell it. You can sell it to a value-added producer. You can make preserves, and you can do U-pick. I don't think there's much in the way of U-pick with fruit in the islands. You could start a fruit CSA, and you could store those fruit and sell them in midwinter. I don't think anyone's doing that yet, but I might be wrong. You can give them away. Food banks will often take fruit. Your friends will take fruit. You could invite a value-added producer to pick your fruit and not charge them for it. You could have a harvest party. You could contribute to a community fundraiser, or you could invite a gleaning group. There are formal gleaning groups on some of the islands who will then distribute fruit. For example, on Lopez, it goes to the school through the food aid that people get, and to some of the private schools also will get fruit from that program. Gleaning can be formal or informal. It's important to understand that some of the roadside trees are traditionally gleaned by people, and you might not want to organize a formal gleaning party until you know that your neighbors aren't depending on those. And gleaning is pest control. So you've got buggy apples. You don't want those laying on the ground and having the insects complete their life cycle on the ground. Unfortunately, we do want to reduce some of the insect population in orchards, so you can feed those to livestock. But getting those apples off the ground, apples, pears, plums, is an important part of controlling that cycle of pests. So I also want to talk to you about how you look after these food forests, because they are an ecosystem that fundamentally has had humans involved from the beginning. They don't need a lot of work, but you can make them more productive and sort of build better habitat by working within what they've already developed. So important things in restoring old trees is that it's not like pruning a young tree. You're not going to change the fundamental shape of that tree. It's not as much work in the sense that you're not taking off as much wood, but they're huge and you want to be really careful. So you want to take your time. The tree is going to try and replace everything you take off. So you want to plan at least 3 years to change an old tree. You don't necessarily want to remove all the dead wood because that dead wood is habitat. So, but if you're starting on a tree, dead, damaged, diseased, the dead wood, the tree won't try and replace. So you don't have to factor that into how much you're removing. You don't want to remove more than 25% of the live wood because that takes so much energy from the tree, and you're going to set yourself up for this ongoing cycle of the tree trying to replace it and you cutting it back off and the tree trying to replace it. And all that energy is going to go into new wood and not into producing fruit. If I recommend that people who are starting on restoring an old orchard work with experts who are familiar with old trees. It's not the same as pruning young trees, but you've got experts in the islands. Consider your habitat value. And if you're looking for quick results on old trees, you can graft them onto new rootstock. The lower tree here is a tree that's got about 10 varieties grafted on it. I was just saving them. That also backs up your tree. So if anything goes wrong, old trees will produce higher quality fruit, different fruit, more fruit than young trees. So I wouldn't recommend grafting and then cutting down the old tree, but grafting a new tree is going to preserve that variety and it'll give you quick results while you slowly restore the old orchard. Don't necessarily take out all the wild fruits either. They're an important part of that habitat as well. Be a good neighbor if you've got an old orchard. The fruit on the ground can potentially be a reservoir of pest species that then can infect other trees. So don't leave them on the ground if they're wormy, because that's where wormy in the sense that these can be all sorts of different kinds of critters. Most of them complete their life cycle in the soil. Consider sharing your harvest and sharing your varieties. Grafting is fun, easy, and will make sure that the varieties that you have that you love are preserved and perpetuated, and that you can always then borrow those back to graft a new tree. And you can ask for help. If you have an old orchard, there are probably people out there, people like me too, who would love to help you look after it. You don't have to do it all on your own. It's a lot of work. You can also help us rediscover these island food forests. We have a project of developing an islands Pomona, which is a catalog of all the varieties that are found here in the islands. And you can contribute to that. So we map out old orchards. This is an example again from this Louis Caillou's orchard. There's a picture of the tea sheet. Then there's this one's an interesting one because the trees don't show up very well in the 1932 aerial at all. And they're kind of obscured. That's I think a 2019 satellite photo. But then the last one there with all the green dots, that's the trees that remain at that orchard. So that's us going out and we GPS those trees, take pictures, depending on whether it's fall when we take pictures of the fruit or winter when we can take cuttings from those trees. And so then we try and catalog what those varieties are. We graft those varieties into our research orchard, try and share some of those grafts back to the folks with the orchard or to other people who want to host old trees. And every time we do this, it helps us build our knowledge of what grows in these old orchards and make sure that we know how to look after them. So you can contribute to that. You can actually map your own trees. I've got some links that let you download an app that you can use for that. You can invite us in. You can take pictures of your fruit. You could come into a grafting. A lot of you probably already know how to graft, but graft your varieties. You can share scions of those varieties. But every time I can look at a fruit that someone knows what it is, it makes it easier for me to identify unknown fruit. And every time I look at unknown fruit that turns out to be the same variety from another orchard, it helps us understand better what that variety might be. So I'm hoping that we'll get more and more of these old orchards into our database and get a better sense of what the varieties are and how they thrive here in the islands. So this is a couple pictures from that orchard at the Cailloux Lagoon. One of these pears are huge. They probably weigh a couple pounds, not quite. They probably weigh a pound each, and a really nice green apple that's not a greening, that's much sweeter. The trees aren't necessarily the same as the fruit in this photo, but that's the kind of documentation we would take when visiting an orchard. Some of the things you can do, you can also trial locally adapted varieties. We look at varieties that grow on roadsides and in old orchards that weren't planted, but came from the seedlings. And one of the things you can do is test those out for us. So there's a variety that grows in the park, the village park in East Sound, that smells kind of like rose water. There's also a little variety on one of the community trails that's the size of a gumball, but isn't a crabapple, has a sweet flavor. So there's lots of interesting varieties that you can try out and see what you think, but you can also host these heritage varieties and help make sure that they survive. And that is my quick tour of the food forests in the islands, plus a whole lot of thank yous, because this work is certainly informed by all the people who've assisted. A lot of the history came from other people, and also everyone who invited me into their orchard. I've had the great privilege of visiting these old food forests, which are mostly on private land, and learned a huge amount from that. So, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Madrona, for teaching us to appreciate a beautiful and important and delicious part of our local environment. I'm sure we have some questions for you. I'm just going to explain in a moment. I'm going to unmute everyone, or give them the opportunity to unmute yourselves so you can ask questions. I think we have enough people that maybe we should use the raise hand feature to ask questions. So to do this, just please find the participants field on the right side of your screen, where all the attendees are listed. If it's not already visible, just move your cursor, bring up the controls at the bottom of your screen, and select the participants icon. That will make that available. And you'll see raise hand icon. Just simply click on that when you have a question, and a small hand will appear by your name in the participants list. And I believe it lines people up at the top of the window in the order that they raise their hands. And I'll just go ahead and call on you. So give me a second here to unmute. All right, you now can unmute yourselves. And all right, so I have some questions. Well, if you're a little bit shy with the raise hand feature, you can go ahead and raise your physical hand. Margot Shaw, go ahead with your question, please.
Yeah, Madrona, thank you so much for this talk. You're always so clear and make it sound simple. Anyway, I'm forgetting the name. Who's the fellow that designed and planted the first big orchard spread in East Sound? What was his name?
East Sound.
He was the first one that realized that these islands were good for that. Whatever he was, Underwood or something like that. Anyway.
Boyd's notes for sure.
Anyway, what I was wondering was, did he purposely plant a big variety of species, as well as different plums, apples, and so forth from the get-go, or did he concentrate on, a whole bunch of one?
Yeah, I don't think so. I know that Van Goren, who was promoting orcharding,
that's who it is, Van Goren.
Okay. So Van Goren actually recommended that folks restrict themselves to just 5 varieties of apple. And he had a list of 5 varieties plus some alternates. And I got that list from the Orchids Historical Society, and it was very useful initially in figuring out what varieties were, because those 5 varieties and the alternates are incredibly common in Orchis orchards and on Lopez on San Juan. But no, he thought that for a proper commercial orchard, you should just have a handful of varieties. People obviously didn't listen to him too much though, because the diversity is much higher. But no, if everyone had taken his advice, there would be just about 7 apple varieties.
So what you showed us, do you know of those? What the 5 varieties were?
So King's, Greenings, 20 ounce. I didn't show you Esopus Spitzenberg, but that was also on his list, and Blue Pearmain. And then I think the alternates might have included Northern Spy. I'll check back through my notes, but those 5 I'm sure of. and probably Gravenstein too. I can't imagine that wasn't on the list. And those do turn out to be some of the most common in island orchards for sure. So people definitely took his advice. I mean, he was selling fruit trees as well, as far as I recall. So I think that made it easier for people to plant those 5 varieties.
And last question on the same line, in the museum side in that orchard, which I guess in East Sound is about the most preserved of that whole area of apple trees. What varieties do you find there?
You know, I'm not sure what the ones in that, I have looked at them, but I've only looked at them when I had a whole team of our science club kids with us. And so I didn't focus in enough on identifying them. So
Okay.
no, I'm not actually sure what those varieties are. Remind me and I'll try and get back out and pin them
Okay.
down. But I honestly don't
Yeah.
know. One of them
Thank
has
you. So-
amazing big,
One of them what?
one of them has amazing big flowers. It's a really pretty apple tree.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Margot. And Gailey, would you go ahead with your question?
Oops, hold on.
Hi, thank you. That was a great presentation. My question is about wildings. I'm curious if you've discovered or mapped any apple or pear wilding trees here on island. So basically ones that have not been grafted, but maybe something was tossed and a seed grew.
Absolutely. It's Orcas is in particular, because there was such an extensive fruit industry, is full of these wilding apples and pears in particular, although plums as well. And when I first started looking at them, I'd assumed that they wouldn't be particularly good varieties because of the randomness. I mean, the diversity of apples and pears is very high. And so we started mapping them at the Connors orchard at Caillou Lagoon. And we were like, okay, so we'll taste them. And if they're good, we'll map them. And we finally had to stop because we were mapping every seedling tree because they were all delicious. So yes, and one of the things that I would love to see happen on Orcas in particular is people adopt some of those varieties, see how they like them, and potentially grow more of them. I know Ed Sy has done some grafting of some of those varieties and given them names. So certainly it's a huge potential. With the pears, it's a little more complicated. The potential for a pear to end up very tannic and not good for fresh eating is very high. On the other hand, I think that creates some pretty good potential for peri pears. And right now I'm hoping to be able to do a project where I evaluate heritage fruit in the islands and these seedling varieties for their potential for cider making, looking at their tannins and sugar and pH and some of the other flavor components. So I look forward to working more with those because they're an absolutely unique resource. These are varieties that grow nowhere else. And because they've never been grafted, pruned, had any insect control, they're not thinned, we know that they grow really, really well here. So yes, that's one of the amazing resources that comes out of these ancient fruit forests is all of these completely unique varieties throughout this agroecosystem.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Nancy, what would you like to ask?
Hi, my name's Nancy Stilger, and thank you, Madrona, for your wonderful presentation. I am the new executive director of the Orcas Island Historical Museum. So I wanted to introduce myself, and we'll get you over here to identify our trees, or to see what info we might have here. And our next exhibition we're going to be doing is on mapping and maps. So I'm hoping I can email and coordinate with you a little about giving your mapping project a little bit of a plug in the exhibition. So I just wanted to say thank you, and I have a lot to learn. I know there's been some stuff on fruit heritage that's on my computer, but I am brand new. So, I'm just learning what's in the collections, et cetera. So I look forward to connecting, and thank you again for presenting on this.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really excited to meet you. I would love to. The Orcas Historical Society has been really important to this research, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on that. So, hi.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Nancy. Sharon.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I have one thing I just want to mention and one thing to ask. So the Onondaga Oh, those were apples, right? The Onondaga apples?
Pears.
Pears, they were pears, Onondaga pears. I wonder if those come from New York, if they have anything to do with the Onondaga tribe of the Algonquin, not the, I mean, of the Iroquois.
I don't think so. I think it's more a geographical name, but they do come from New York as far as I'm aware. And I will check back. I've got some good historical info on pear varieties and find out how they got that name, but I think it's because of where they came from without much direct reference to the people, unfortunately.
So it could be New York, but we really don't know. Anyway, I have one question. You know where Mike Hurwich and I live is pretty alpine. It's like 1,400 feet up. We've never tried to grow a fruit tree, but would it be a ridiculous thing to attempt to do?
Probably not. I mean, there's definitely an old orchard near Cascade Lake. It may not be quite so alpine there, but and if you're looking, I mean, one thing would be to try a quince, for example, because they seem to be one of the least in need of lots of direct sun and very tolerant of sort of more challenging conditions. But no, I think there's definitely some things that would grow there. It certainly would be worth a try. You can also graft onto the native crabapple. So if it's the kind of environment where the native crabapple might do all right, instead of using a commercial apple rootstock, you can graft onto that. It'll make it a little more tolerant of, well, salt's not going to be an issue there, but it'll make it more tolerant of both salt and water. So they'll grow in marshy areas and salty areas. I don't know that it'll confer cold or shade tolerance, but that might be an option. And certainly if there's a variety you're interested in, I'm happy to try and track it down and graft one for you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sharon. Anita, what was your question, please?
Unmute myself. Okay, I had a question. I don't have a place to really grow trees, but I'm interested in gleaning because I do know that there's a lot of fruit that goes to waste. Madrona, can you point me at any groups or people on Orcas that I might contact when it comes around closer to harvest time and get involved to help with some gleaning?
On orchids, I'm not sure. I'd have to ask around. I did ask around San Juan this fall and found that there wasn't a formal gleaning group. Lopez seems to have the most organized one. So let me take a look and get back to you. I'll try and, if I track down good gleaning groups on orchids, I'll post something on Kwiat's Facebook page.
Yeah, and personally, I'll be seeing you a lot this summer, so I think to ask you.
Yeah, I neglected to check into that before this presentation, but
Okay.
And if there isn't a gleaning group, there are still gleaning opportunities generally. So I can also help try and track some of those down, but it's a good question. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Anita. Cindy, what is your question, please?
Thank you, Madrona, for the talk today. We have one tree on our property that I assume is quite old. What aspects of the tree do you use to identify it? Is it just the apple or blossoms, leaf, bark? I don't know. What I need to look at to identify it?
So I primarily work with the fruit. I know that other people, so Lori Bakken is out in the islands right now working on identifying pears, and she's out now because they're in flower, pears and apples. I'm not familiar enough with the flowers of the particular varieties to be really good at using them. The guide that I use for identifying fruit is called the Apples of New York, and it does include descriptions of things like flowers and leaves, but it only has sketches of the fruit, and they're not particularly great. So it's mostly just descriptions. So I use the ripe fruit and look at the inside of them as well as the outside. The only, I think with pears and plums, there might be more to be gleaned from the flowers and flower timing and the leaves. Like prunes have quite different leaves than green gages, for example. But with apples, primarily it's the fruit. There's one exception. The king apple has a particularly robust growth form, and sometimes you can at least narrow down that it might be a king just by looking at the tree, but that's not true of most of the apple varieties. So there are resources out there that include information on things like blooming time and leaves and the types of flowers, but I find that the fruit themselves are the most critical feature to look at.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Lynn, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much, Madrona, for a wonderful presentation. We live out here in Caillou Valley, and on our property, we happen to have a pear tree called the Orcas pear, and you alluded to it. Could you give us some more information about the origin or the history of the Orcas pear tree?
Yeah, so the Orcas pear is not an old variety, but it is a uniquely Orcas variety. It was discovered on Orcas. I'm going to completely forget the name of the fellow who discovered it. And it's a wonderful pear because it ripens on the tree. You can actually pick them ripe. You can also pick them a little early and ripen them off tree, but it makes it a very accessible pear, very delicious. Yeah, discovered on Orcas Island from a roadside tree. That tree has been moved, but as far as I know, still exists. And since that time commercialized. So it is definitely a uniquely adapted. So it's like one of those wildings we were talking about, except for it's one that has been propagated and spread around and is now an important part of the home orcharding, at least in the Pacific Northwest. So that, yeah, no, it comes absolutely from Orcas, was discovered on Orcas, but isn't actually one of the heritage varieties. It's the legacy of all those ancient food forests, but something new. I think it was discovered in the 70s. And you're lucky to have one. They're wonderful.
They are, they're very delicious, and we get an abundant crop off of just one tree. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And I'm going to thank Madrona. We're just about here at the top of the hour. So thanks again for sharing your expertise and your time with us, Madrona. And thanks to all of you for joining us, the Orcas Senior Center Meeting of the Minds on Zoom. If you'd care to donate, we would suggest a donation of $5. You can make that either by online or personal check. I've posted our information for doing so in the chat box. So if you can see that on the side of your screen, or you can click on the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, that will open that up for our mailing address and email address and so forth. Please join us next month. It's going to be May 19th, and we're going to have Tina Whitman from Friends of the San Juans, and she's going to be presenting Foraged Fishes and the Beach, the role of local shorelines in marine ecosystem recovery. So we're looking forward to that. And just a reminder, if you'd like to receive a reminder of this next event prior to the event, just go ahead and go to the Senior Center website and register there, and you'll get a reminder. So, and then other than that, I think we'll just bid you all adieu, and thank you so much. And thanks again to Madrona, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.